In MagicPony, we learn single image 3D reconstruction models of articulated object categories. And we learn only from online photo collections without any explicit 3D geometric supervision or template shapes.
Welcome to Talking Papers, the podcast where we talk about papers and let the papers do the talking. We host early career academics and PhD students to share their cutting-edge research in computer vision, machine learning, and everything in between. I'm your host, Itzik Ben Shabbat, a researcher by day and podcaster by night. Let's get started. Hello and welcome to Talking Papers, the podcast where we talk about papers and let the papers do the talking. Today we will be talking about the paper MagicPony, Learning Articulated 3D Animals in the Wild. This paper was published in CVPR 2023, and I'm happy to host the author of the paper, Tomas Jakab. Hello, Tomas, and welcome to the podcast. Can you introduce yourself?
Hello, thanks for having me. I'm Tom, and I'm a postdoc at VGG at Oxford University, where I also did my PhD with my advisor, Andrea Vedalti. In my research, I'm curious about how we can uncover the structure of objects without any supervision. And on this front, I have done quite some work on unsupervised key points before moving on to capturing the full 3D shapes of objects.
And who are the co-authors of this paper?
So for this paper, we have three equal contribution authors. Elliot, that is currently a postdoc at Stanford. Ray, that is going to be, he was actually undergrad student in Oxford, and he's going to be joining us next year as a PhD student, and then myself. And the senior contributing authors are Chris, that is now starting at computer science as a tenure track professor, and also in Oxford, and then my advisor, Andrea Vedalti.
Quite a lineup. In the TLDR kind of format, 2-3 sentences. What is this paper about?
All right, so in MagicPony, we learn single image 3D reconstructor of articulated animal categories. We learn only from a collection of images that we can obtain easily online. And we don't use any 3D supervision or template shape, unlike some other comparable works. And when the method is trained, it can reconstruct articulated 3D shape and an appearance of an object from only a single image. And on top of that, our reconstructions can be animated or re-rendered from arbitrary viewpoints. What is also cool about this method is that while we train only on real images, it can also generalize to abstract drawings or even images of toys.
Wow, this is super cool, and I got super curious. But just to kind of define the problem, right, for people that don't understand it, like from just those few sentences. So your input is just an image, right? RGB pixel image.
Yeah.
And how does your output look? So what is the output?
So just to be clear, so like in the test time when the method is trained, it's only an RGB image. And regarding the output, so there are, we can then talk about it later when we delve into the details of how this learning works. But it's basically this auto-encoding model. So we decompose the image into many components. And that is later useful because we can manipulate these components. And these components are albedo, deformation that is specific for each instance, articulation that is specific for each image. We also predict the light, and finally the viewpoint. So it's all these components together, but you can summarize it as outputting a 3D shape, the viewpoint, and the appearance or the texture.
Right. So at this time, your input is an RGB image and your output is a 3D shape that you can manipulate and kind of have the texture and the lighting and appearance, everything kind of baked into that. All right. So obviously this problem is very, very challenging, but what are kind of the main challenges when tackling this problem?
So what this makes really difficult is the learning part, right? So we constrain ourselves to have only collection of single view images. So let's say that we focus on horses, which is the main kind of animal in our paper. So let's say that we have horses and we have just single view images of them. Like, how do you recover the 3D shape? This is not an easy task. Like, if we have multi-view, then we already know how to do it. We have all these established methods. But from a single view, that is so under constraint. So how do we do that, right? This is not easy. But the trick is to consider this single view image collections as actually multi-view image collection if you factor out what makes these images different. And this is exactly what our method does. So, the concept of horse, like there are, like all the horses are kind of related to each other if you factor out the differences. And the differences are in appearance. So, you can have brown horse, white horse, and so. The difference is in the articulation, and in general, like horses can take different shapes, right? There can be some horse can be smaller, bigger. I'm not a biologist, but we know that horses can have different shapes, but not so much different. And then the other difference is the camera viewpoint. So like if you can factor out all what makes these things different, then you can consider this collection as a multi-view collection, as a multi-view collection of images to learn the 3D shape. So then you basically can assume that now you see this shape from different viewpoints, and that can be used as a learning signal when you then render this image. So basically, like, this is the key trick, or like the kind of mental framework how we think about this single view image collection, and that helps us later down to design the method and recover the full 3D shape.
Yeah, and I can totally understand why like this is an interesting problem to solve, because images we can find online a lot, right? But getting something labeled with 3D labels and all those kind of things, that's difficult to get, right? It's expensive to do. So if you can create this kind of method that doesn't need those labels, right? It can just take the RGB images and factor out these differences and use it as kind of this multi-view, but not really multi-view, right? To use as a supervision, then that's super helpful.
Exactly. Like this is exactly the motivation behind this. We have insane amount of images on the internet, so it is very useful to create methods that can distill this 3D information from them, and this is what we do in this work.
Okay, super interesting. And if we move on to the relative work section, so before coming to read your paper, which one or two papers should anyone read? So there's already existing line of work that is trying to learn 3D shapes from single view image collections. They tend to mostly use more supervision than we do, but they kind of started this. The work that I would recommend is CMR, which is work by Anju Kanazawa, already from, I think, like 5 years ago. It's learning category-specific mesh reconstruction from image collections. And this work kind of started this line of research. But at the time, they had to use more supervision, like, for example, supervised key points. So that would be for this. And then for the techniques that we employ in the paper, I would recommend you reading Deep Marching Tetrahedra, which is a paper that
kind of marries two different approaches for modeling 3D shapes, an implicit approach and explicit approach in form of mesh. And finally, I think, but probably many people already know this work, I would recommend reading Dino features, which we leverage quite heavily in this work.
All right. Excellent. Super interesting works. I will make sure to put links to all of them in the episode's description. Okay. And now moving on to the interesting part, right? The approach. So tell us, how did you do it?
So as I already mentioned previously, we want to disentangle the different factors of the image formation process. So you can think about this as an autoencoder that takes an image and decomposes this image into the different factors that are albedo, deformation, some also light, and camera viewpoint. And the reason we do that is, as I was discussing before, we need to somehow treat these images as a multi-view, because that is the only way we can supervise the 3D shape. So we try to factor out what makes each of these objects in the image collection different. So one thing that I should highlight is that we always consider that we have same category in the given image collection, because this is important. What I think is like the most critical part of this approach is to find out how we can model the shape differences between the different animals or between the different objects. And this is really the key. So for example, if we consider horses, we have two kinds of deformations. One deformation is instance specific. So each horse has different shape. But then also these objects are articulated, and we have some articulation that usually results in larger deformation than the instance specific deformation. And this is really the key, because we can model these larger deformations using an explicit deformation model. So we just use blend skinning. We establish some skeleton inside the shape, and then we predict the rotation of each bones. And this lets us to model large deformations. Whereas the instance-specific deformation, we can highly constrain this. And this is important because the core of the method is to learn a prior shape representation for the whole category. And this is what makes this data set kind of a multi-view data set, that inside of the method, there is a prior mesh that relates all these objects that we observe in images together. And this prior mesh is learned while we are learning the full model. So in order to learn good prior mesh, we need to restrict the deformation that goes from the prior mesh into the instance-specific mesh, or into what we observe in the images. And factoring the deformation in two parts, one that models the instance-specific deformation, and the other one that models the articulation, is really important here. So if you then check our papers, you can look what this prior mesh look like, and it actually really learns some sort of average kind of looking horse that is maybe like too smooth. It does not have the details of the horse that we then observe in the image, but it helps us to link all these shapes together.
Right. So let me quickly recap everything that you just said, right? So you get an RGB images input, and then you kind of decompose it into the different factors that make out this view of the world, right? So let's say you have a horse in the image, you decompose it to the shape, the albedo, the deformations, the viewpoint, and all of those kind of things. But then actually what is really interesting is that while you're training this thing, you're basically learning kind of a prior on how a horse looks like, right? So you have this average looking horse, which doesn't look like any other horse you've ever seen. It's just this kind of over smoothed horse that then you can first deform to be the specific horse that in the image, right? And then not only that it's the specific horse that in the image, it's also in the pose and kind of the angle that the horse in the image is at, right? So this is how you kind of factor these out. And this is what you said, this is the key idea why this is working, right? This entanglement between the instance level deformation and the articulation level deformation.
Exactly. And I think this is really important for people to understand. Like, so if you consider the extreme scenario where you don't constrain the deformation that goes from the prior shape to the instance specific shape, if you don't constrain that, then because the only supervision we have is, I will talk about it later as well, but the only supervision that we have is reconstruction loss. There are different reconstruction losses, but at the end of the day, we are just comparing 2D images together. And so if you don't constrain this deformation, it would just overfit completely to that image and it would not learn anything about the geometry, right? It can just output any kind of crazy shape it wants just to exactly fit the observed image. So this is very important. And the reason we need to decompose it into two kinds of deformation, like the instance specific and the articulation specific, is because we would not be able to model the articulation with instance specific deformation because there's no nice way of limiting the large deformations and separating them from the smaller instance specific deformations. And this is exactly like what the method then does automatically.
Right. Okay. And so, okay, now you have those different deformations separated. What's the next part?
So the next part, as I already highlighted before, like there are other things that we need to predict that form the image. So together with the deformation, it's the appearance. And we also factor out the appearance into two components. One is albedo and the other one is directional light. And once we have all these components together with predicted camera, we can render the image, we can render the object, and we try to recreate the image that we observed. And that would then later on form one of the losses. It would be the image reconstruction loss. But on top of that, we have other reconstruction losses that I can talk about.
Yeah, before we do that. So basically, you get the image, you extract some features, you then decompose it to get this prior shape and the instance-specific kind of deformation from that shape, and then the articulation-specific deformation, which is much louder to basically say, oh, the horse's leg is up in the air and his head is tilted to the left, right? Then you get those additional appearance-based inputs, right? So you get the albedo and the lighting, right? And the camera position, and then you can render this entire shape and say, okay, look, now I have an image of that particular object, of this horse, and I can compare it to the original image and say, okay, does this match, right? I want to match perfectly because if I did a good job reconstructing everything, then they should match really, really well. We should probably mention that there is a mask, right? There's a segmentation mask that basically kind of separates the background because you're not dealing with the background, you're only dealing with the object.
Exactly. So that's what I wanted to mention. So we have other reconstruction losses. One of them is the mask loss. So we can separate the background from the foreground because in this way we are not modeling the background in any way. And in general, like this helps learning. And this is sort of like the last kind of hard supervision that is in the method. But at the same time, nowadays it's quite easy to obtain masks for different categories. So it's not such a big problem, I think. And then on top of that, we have another reconstruction loss, which is very critical. And I will talk about it in more detail.
Yeah. Tell us about this additional loss. I'm curious.
So this reconstruction loss is using dyno features. So basically, we run the input image through dyno VIT and obtain features. And what people found that these features that we get from dyno, they are very they are very useful for obtaining correspondences. And this is something that we want to exploit in this work, because one of the things that we also need to predict are the cameras, and together with shape. And all these things can be ambiguous, because it's like a chicken and egg problem. You predict shape, but that also depends on the camera that you predict. So how do you disentangle this? Like, it's very difficult, because one thing depends on each other. And the dyno features help us to do that. So what we do is, while we are learning the prior shape, we are also learning a texture that is a dyno texture. So this is different from the texture that we see in the RGB image. The goal of this texture is to be able to capture the dyno features. And the reason we learn it together, like with the prior shape, is because we assume, and that's kind of the feature of dyno features, that all the horses share the same dyno features. And this is true to like very large extent. And this gives us then correspondences essentially like across the whole data set of images. So we learn these dyno feature, like we learn this one texture map that is shared for all the horses that we are predicting. Then and then we render it. And then it's very similar to rendering the RGB texture, but in this case, these are features. And we ask the network to predict. There is no it's a single feature, so there is no like prediction of that. It's basically optimized when learning. And so we ask that this texture looks similar to the features that we extract for each image.
Right. Okay, this is a really interesting part here, right? So basically, you're taking the dyno features, you're extracting them for the RGB, but then what you're basically saying is the 3D shape, if we snap or render an image of that 3D shape from a certain angle, it should have the same dyno features, right? So basically, you can say in some way, every point on the surface of that shape that you just had has like a corresponding dyno feature with it, that if you project it back to the image plane, they should match the original dyno features that are extractable. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yes.
Right. Wow. Super interesting approach.
And so we are not the first one. Like there were some other works leveraging dyno features around this, around the same time. But we found that for us, it works really well. And especially it's useful for recovering the correct camera pose, which will be probably the next thing that we will discuss together. Because
just before we discuss this, right? So before we discuss it, so far we have 3 losses, right? So we have first the reconstruction loss, where you try to get the input image to match the rendered image, right? Second is the mask loss, right? Where you have like the input mask on the object, and then the same goes for the output that you render. And third is the dyno loss, right? The one that you basically try to match the dyno features from the RGB and the dyno features from the projection.
Yes.
All right. So tell us about the next bit.
So the next bit are the cameras. And as I already mentioned, the dyno features are very important. And one of the reasons for that is because when we look at these images, there are a lot of symmetries. That's especially evident when we look at the mask of these horses. And as we mentioned, mask is one of the important losses that we use. And so, for example, if you look at a mask of a horse that you see from the side, sometimes, you can confuse the head from tail. Like you will not confuse that. You are human, but like this machine, it needs to learn all these concepts from scratch. And so it's very easy to confuse head and tail, for example. If we, for example, then tilt the object, so that we see it just slightly from sideways and the horse is looking at us. Again, from the silhouette, because of the projection, we might not be able to know whether the horse is actually pointing the head towards us or whether it's actually pointing the head away from us if it's kind of tilted. And so there are all these symmetries that are very difficult to deal with. And many previous methods, they end up in this local optima where they are just predicting some of these symmetries. So, for example, the methods can never predict horse facing away from you. It's always going to be facing towards you. Because when you then render it and project it, it kind of looks realistic. The network thinks, oh, I fulfilled the task, but it's wrong. And this is where the dyno features are helpful. But on top of that, because if, for example, you are optimizing, so when we are optimizing the pose, if you have the situation where the horse is facing towards you, but it should be facing away from you, or if the horse have the head predicted on the other side of the body, if you imagine that you are rotating these horses to get them in the right position, it needs to get worse before it gets better in terms of the reconstruction loss. Yeah, does that make sense? So if you, for example, if you have a side view of a horse and you want to rotate it in the correct position, which is by rotating it 180 degrees around, it will have to go through all these poses that look implausible when you look at the input image or at the mask.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense, right? If you're looking from one angle and it's the wrong angle, it's actually the one that's completely opposite to that angle. You're going to have to go through the entire shape where it's completely messed up and not what you're looking for before you find the right angle.
Exactly. And so as the network is learning everything from scratch, as it becomes smarter, in quotes, it would need to make this switch suddenly. It can't do some intermediate step. There would need to be abrupt switch. Okay, now I will rearrange everything. And that's that's not possible. So what we do is that we propose a multi-hypothesis viewpoint prediction. This has been already done before, but we find that we only need 4 different hypotheses because we exploit the symmetries that I just discussed. So we kind of narrow down the possible failure modes and predict only 4 different hypotheses. And this speeds up the training much more than other methods that need to predict 10, 20, 40 different cameras at a time, because then you need to do this whole rendering pass. That is very expensive, and that would make the training slow. So the fact that you can now predict only 4 different hypotheses, it's very useful. But we also take it further than that, which is something that I will discuss as well.
So basically 4 is because of 4 quadrants, right? You're basically positioning one in each quadrant, and then that's where you position it.
Yes. Yeah. So it's exactly these symmetries. It's the symmetry, left and right symmetry. Is the tail really the head, or is it really a tail? We don't know. So that's one of the symmetries that you can imagine. And the other one is whether the animal is looking at us or away from us. And that basically then translates into dividing the space into 4 quadrants. Mm-hmm. So if you go, imagine that you go around the horse with the camera, then you can imagine yourself that you always end up in 4 different quadrants. If you look at the kind of the ground play from the top, you can just you can nicely separate it around the symmetries. So you would split the horse in half, and then in another half you would have the 4 quadrants. And then in each of these quadrants, you predict the camera separately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And this is very kind of subject specific, right? Because we're talking about a horse, but most animals that you've been working with have this similar symmetry, right? But let's say if we have, I don't know, a spherical object, then that would be even, I don't know how you would handle a spherical object, right? Because luckily there's no spherical animals out there. Maybe some fish.
That is true. So it's exploiting
symmetries.
The kind of the symmetries that animals exhibit in general. And because this work mostly focuses on articulated animals, like we work with like mostly quadruped animals. So like this sort of reasoning applies to them very well. If you want to go beyond that, at some point, these assumptions can break, and then you would need to adjust the method.
Yeah. We'll talk about that in the limitations section of the paper.
Yes. So the last thing I wanted to mention regarding these multiple hypotheses is that, so we minimize the number of the multiple hypotheses to 4. But that still requires us to render 4 different versions of the input image, which is expensive. But we don't do that actually in practice. We render only 1. And the way we can do it is because we are also on the fly learning another predictor that is trying to predict which of these 4 hypotheses is the correct one. And so at the beginning of the training, we allow sampling from also the ones that are less probable. So we have a parameter that can that basically decays as the training goes. So at the beginning of training, it's also sampling from cameras that might not be so optimal, but because the model is not trained yet, it really does not know. And as the training goes, the kind of the weight goes towards the more probable cameras. And so basically like this way we distribute the learning of the multiple hypotheses across iterations instead of having sacrificing batch size. And that's more efficient in the end.
Right. Yeah, because training this can get pretty heavy, so you don't want to evaluate like so many images from so many angles, right? So you kind of limit it to 4, and then even in those 4, you kind of have this scalar associated with each of them saying, this is the most probable one, you should be evaluating this one more. But in the beginning, before the model is trained well and it's more confident, let's say, then you want to kind of take from everyone until it gets like more robust, and then you can just take the most probable angle.
Exactly.
Okay, so good time to move to the results section of the method, right? So we know how this works. You get an image as input, you decompose everything, you render it, and then you train it by using those 3 reconstruction losses that we talked about earlier. How do you evaluate this? What are the metrics?
Yeah, so one of the common things to do in this area is to use key point transfer metric. So basically, because our meshes are learned in a canonical space. So if you have 2 images of a different horse, you can find, so for each point on the horse, you can find a corresponding point on another horse. Because we learn everything in the same canonical frame, which is another very useful property of this method, because it also helps you to understand the objects, not only get their shape, but you also understand something. You get dense correspondences by default. And that lets us to then evaluate it on a key point transfer task, where you have some predefined matching key points for pairs of images of different instances, and you try to find the corresponding key point from one image on image of another horse. And then you just measure how big mistake you made in terms of how far you are from the key point on the other horse when you did the transfer. So this is one of the metrics. So if you can do this well, if you predict the shape accurately together with the camera, the metric should be lower. It's a proxy metric, so that's a caveat. But unfortunately, there are no suitable 3D benchmark for 3D animals, because we would either need to create synthetic benchmarks, or we would need to go around cows in the fields and scan them, ask them to be still. That can be very tricky. So for these kind of animals in the wild, there are currently no good benchmarks. So we need to use these proxy metrics, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. And during your evaluation process, were there any unexpected results?
So what really surprised us is how well it works on images that are not real, like drawings, paintings, cartoons, and even toys or some sort of artistic artifacts of animals. So that was very surprising to us. But one of the reasons for that is because we are using a Dino feature extractor. And on top of that, we are actually training our regressor. So the regressor that is trained in our case, it already sees kind of parsed version of the image, because it's first parsed by the VIT Dino encoder into features, and that lets the model to generalize. But so that was kind of surprising, but at the same time, it's not very unexpected, given that we know that Dino features are consistent regardless the lighting conditions. They are also quite invariant to different textures, and so.
Yeah, right. This is a super interesting result, right? I mean, sure, it's kind of baked into the Dino features, but still, you kind of train it only on RGB images. You expect it to only work on natural RGB images, and then you take something artistic and it works. It's always surprising and nice to see.
But so one thing is that it's baked into the Dino features, but on top of that, like, our method learns quite good priors of what these shapes tend to look like, or what is their articulation.
Right. Any fail cases that you discovered?
So most of the failure cases are related to the viewpoint prediction, because despite all the tricks that we use, sometimes it's just very ambiguous, and sometimes it's even ambiguous for us humans. So this is still quite unsolved task, like how to have a reliable viewpoint prediction under all conditions.
Let's move on to the conclusions and future work section of the paper. So how do you see the impact of the paper going forward, and have there been any follow-up works? Yeah,
so one obvious thing that we can do with this is to extend it to videos. So for now, we were using only image collections. We have a prior work that was already working with videos, but we did not want to now dilute the paper too much. But the nice thing about this hierarchical approach is that it helps you to incorporate videos very easily. Because since we model the shape of each instance individually, now we can, for a video sequence of a given instance, we can assume that the shape is the same up to the articulation. So that would be like one very obvious way to extend this, and the method is already ready to be able to do that. In terms of other extension, we have a paper on arXiv called Farm 3D, and that paper is taking diffusion models and replacing the real images that we used with training with images that are synthesized from stable diffusion. And that is kind of cool. So, like, one of the dirty secrets of unsupervised methods is that although they are unsupervised, they still need some training data. And they don't need like any kind of training data. Usually the images needs to be curated to some extent. So the images that you use to train unsupervised methods, they tend to be usually free of occlusions. They don't contain a lot of noise. There are no unusual viewpoints. And that still needs to be done by humans. Someone needs to go and collect the image data set, filter out all the noise. But that is annoying. So if you want to train it on a new category, you still need to do this annoying task. But we find out that the images that are generated from stable diffusion are actually really suitable for training models like ours. And one of the reasons for that is because although stable diffusion is trained on these sort of noisy images that can contain who knows what, they do implicitly curation of this data. They kind of remove the noise because they need to learn some compact representation of this data set. And so when you generate images of, for example, horses, they will tend to be without occlusion. There will be like one horse centered in the image, and there's not going to be like suddenly a hydrant in front of the horse, you know?
So you're kind of getting the curation for free from Stable Diffusion.
Exactly. And that is really amazing for this sort of problem that we are dealing with, because then we can just say, oh, we want now model for sheep, we want model for a cow, for giraffe, and we can immediately get a training data for that. And we don't need to do any manual curation, which is amazing. And on top of that, because it's Stable Diffusion, like everyone's seen works like Dream Fusion that are using this, the image diffusion models for as a general image prior. You can also use it to further supervise the 3D shape. So you can render your model from not only the viewpoint that we've seen in the input image, but we can render it from any virtual viewpoint, any viewpoint that we imagine, and then we can ask the Stable Diffusion or other diffusion model whether that looks realistic, and that helps us to further regularize the shape. And that turns out to be important because one of the limitations that I also did not mention, but it's related to the data set, is that our data sets tend to be biased. And one of the problems is that we almost never see horse from the top. Yeah? Right. So if you Google horse, how many images of horses from the top you have? And this is one of the limitations of our work, but basically any work that is working with these data sets. So actually, if you look at our horses, sometimes they have kind of a hole on the top. And that's because the horse has never been seen from the top. So that is kind of funny bias that is in the data set, and you need to somehow solve it, like somehow overcome it. And Stable Diffusion is not perfect at that because it's also trained on similar data sets with similar biases, but it does better job than it does relatively good job at fixing these sort of views that fixing, for example, the holes from the top that are caused by lacking the top-down views, because you have sort of like a control when you are generating the training data set. You can also control the viewpoints to some extent, and that can help you to fix these biases but only to some extent.
Right. Wow, super interesting follow-up works then, and still a lot of stuff to do in this domain for future researchers looking into going into this. It seems like there's a lot of impact here to be done, and the results look much better than what they were before, but there is a way to go, right? It's still not as good as, fully supervised methods, but there won't be any fully supervised methods because who is going to, fully articulate a horse and a cow and a cat and a bird, right?
Exactly.
So super interesting field.
I think the applications eventually are tremendous because you can instantly recreate 3D shape of any object that you see in your image collection, right? So you can create assets for virtual environments. You can edit images in 3D. You don't like pose of some object in your image. You can just flip it in 3D very easily. No need for Photoshop. So the amount of applications is just insane, but we need to get to that quality. And probably the way to go is to then marry supervised methods with these unsupervised approaches, because there is always going to be more annotated data, like data without any labels, than annotated data or collections of 3D shapes. So the way to go is to marry both approaches together.
Right. Okay. And on this super interesting note on how to future works should go, it would be interesting to talk about what did Reviewer 2 say, which is my favorite part of the podcast. So please share some insightful comments that you had in the review process.
Reviewer 2 is the typical anti-hero that we unfortunately have. So I have to say that with this paper, the reviews were quite smooth. So it was this kind of standard thing, like asking for more results, more evaluation, and test cases. But we've been working on this topic for quite a while. And one of the struggles that we've been always having is to, in general, like in this sort of unsupervised area, was to convince people that that the results are great, even though the shape is still not ready for some real world applications. So even though we were like consistently making steps forward, people were somehow biased towards, I guess, what they see with NERF. That they see this super, although it's very different problem, they see this super like high resolution, high quality result. And I feel like it maybe might bias some people when they are looking at these methods, because they look at it and they are like, oh, but the shape is not good, And you can always pinpoint some inaccuracies, like, no way the shape is great. But I think it's important to have some checkpoints along the way. Otherwise, we would be just having no papers for 5 years, and then we would publish paper that suddenly solves everything. But also, we don't know, is it going to take another 5 years? So I think it's important for community to appreciate the intermediate results as long as they are improving the current baseline or removing some supervision.
Yeah, I think the current state of the community in general is that methods are becoming better and better, especially supervised methods. So you're kind of getting used to these amazing product-ready results. And then this work comes along, right, where they say, oh, we're removing a bunch of stuff that are considered as trivial in many other methods, right? So no direct supervision because we don't have it and you can't get it. And then the result look a little bit less than what you got used to, right? Because sure, if you don't know how a horse looks from the top, there's no way you're going to figure that out without any kind of supervision data. And then that like, yeah, and then the comment and the review comments might be like, oh, the results are not good enough. But in practice, this is actually a significant step forward compared to what existed previously, right? And there needs to be a stage and like a place for these papers.
Exactly.
In conferences as well.
Like, do people remember what first gun paper looked like?
Yeah, exactly, right? The first gun paper.
And now we have all these amazing guns that it's just insane where it went. But without these intermediate results, we would never get there.
Amazing progress in our field, definitely. Super, super fast, super big strides. All right. Before we wrap up, is there anything else that we haven't covered that you would like to share?
I just think that this is a very exciting time to be. It's slightly stressful given the progress in various areas that are going very close to application-ready results. So we need to also accelerate. But it's also very exciting. It's the first time you see these things really working. So I think we need to keep pushing hard, and hopefully we will not be taken over by just big companies, and there will be still some research left for us in academia.
There will always be.
Overall, yes. But overall, it's really cool to see things working.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, it seems like a lot of industry is kind of moving into this space, and there was even a nice workshop on that at CVPR. They call it scholars and big models, right? It's a super good workshop with great speakers kind of discussing the future of the field. I personally think there's still a lot of work to be done in academia. I think we just need to adapt and find the right problems. And I think your work is a great example of this kind of problem, right? Because the technology is still not there, so the big companies are not swooping in yet because, this is not product ready, but definitely there's a lot of interesting research still to do in this domain.
Definitely.
All right. So on that optimistic note, Tom, thank you very much for being a part of the podcast. And until next time, let your papers do the talking.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening. That's it for this episode of Talking Papers. Please subscribe to the podcast feed on your favorite podcast app. All links are available in this episode description and on the Talking Papers website. If you would like to be a guest on the podcast, sponsor it, or just share your thoughts with us, feel free to email talking.papers.podcast@gmail.com. Be sure to tune in every week for the latest episodes. And until then, let your papers do the talking.